do you fantasize about going off and exploring continents unknown?
No, I don't know that I ever did. I just enjoyed the read,
Mm-hmm.
and putting myself out there. But thinking of doing it, no, I don't think so.
Really?
No, that's a good question. It's funny. Why didn't I?
Yeah.
No, I didn't.
What about like when the when the war started? Do you remember having any fantasies of going off and fighting the Germans or anything like that?
For one thing, I was too young. No.
Okay.
No, it never occurred to me to do that, and I was just too young to do that. When I graduated from high school, it was 1946. I was 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I was still too young, even when I graduated from high school,
Sure.
to even think of enlisting.
Yeah.
And so the war was already over.
Sure.
No, that never became a thought. I was very conscious of the war, as I think we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
Very conscious of the war. Radio is much more than television in some respects. Radio has a way of stirring the imagination because you can't see what's being explained is happening by the voice out there in radio land.
Mm-hmm.
And the descriptions of some of the war battles were so vivid. We now talk about the Edward R. Murrow broadcasts. That was just one, but there were many, many, many others as well. And the impression that they made, just visually in the mind, with the narrations that they give of the facts and the stories that they were telling,
mm-hmm.
were pretty potent for a young kid.
Yeah.
They really were.
And
I remember being mightily impressed.
Okay.
By it.
And that that didn't stir any kind of thoughts of I wanted to go see that or anything. It was just purely
No.
Okay. Interesting.
No.
Yeah.
No.
I guess conversely to the thought of radio and really I guess books even. Do you remember the first time you went to a movie?
We didn't go to a movie. I think my father and mother they were not moviegoers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, they didn't have money.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it only cost a quarter or 50 cents or whatever it was. They didn't have money to throw away, as they would have called it. And they were of a kind of a religious background that movies were sort of on the fringe.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't go to movies. I remember once my father took, I think, my brother and me to Radio City Music Hall, and we saw a early Greer Garson movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which one it was. No, I'm really not sure. I think I could probably sort of figure it out if I saw the list, but it was a Greer Garson movie, I remember, and that was the only movie I saw until literally I was in high school.
Really?
In my senior year of high school.
Really?
Never saw one after that.
What movie did you see in your senior year of high school?
That I don't remember.
Yeah.
It was movies that we had some movies at the boys' school that I graduated from in Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
We would occasionally have a movie night, but I don't remember any of them. Not at all.
Yeah. Interesting. When you let's see here. Obviously, you travel around a decent amount for you actually were able to leave the city and go to visit the farm and everything like that. Do you remember traveling the train? Didn't you several times?
I think we must have, and I can't remember the train rides during those years. We did travel a train. I remember we carried a basket. The only thing I can remember is sort of a vague memory of my mother and father always believed that we should never buy something while we're traveling. We should always carry it with us. And so they always had a picnic basket of something or other with enough supplies for whatever. And I remember that we took a basket of food on one train ride that I do remember we did. We must have taken more than just one, but I don't remember much about that. I don't know why. You'd think I would, but I don't.
Yeah. And but then traveling, obviously, we talked about your father's old Buick, I believe it was, right?
Right, an old 1928 Buick.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you have any other memories of cars? Like, do you remember when like the Model A came out, or?
Model A was already out when I was born.
Yeah.
Model A's go back to 1929.
Okay.
28, I think, was the first Model A. I believe that's right.
Okay.
Model T was before then, I believe, but the Model A succeeded it, and they had several versions of it over about a 4-year period, 5-year maybe, I don't know, and then they started getting into the 1934, 35. Finally, in 1935, I think it was, they came out with a V8, which was a big deal. Which, of course, all of the highwayman type robber characters used to love that V8 engine. You know.
Talking about the old flathead?
Yeah. Pardon?
Talking about the old flathead V8? Or?
Yeah. Oh, the old very definitely a flathead V8. Yeah. No valve and head those days. No, it was all flathead. Yeah. Yeah. It was the old push rods. And then I remember my grandfather in Wisconsin used to have Buicks. And I remember we went sometime in the middle of the Depression, and he had about a 1936-7 Buick or 2 in the garage. And that was the automobile stable, so to speak, for the farm.
Yeah.
In those days.
Yeah.
My father didn't keep that Buick, that 1928 Buick. Things got rough during the Depression, and it was gone. I don't remember when he let it go, but it must have been fairly early. I bet by 1934 it was gone. 35 maybe. I don't know.
Do you have any memory of like? Obviously, you know, you are rather fond of cars. Do you remember the first time you were impressed by a car or taken by a car?
We lived in New York City. I was impressed by cars all the time.
Yeah.
I remember there was always somebody with money.
Yeah.
And so there were some pretty fancy cars. And I remember in those days, some of the Packards of the day were pretty terrific. And I remember one particular one. It was a convertible coupe. It was an incredibly beautiful blue paint convertible. It had the longest engine I'd ever seen, and it was a V12 or a V16 or a straight 16.
Yeah.
I was told once that they originally got 16-cylinder engines by putting 2 8-cylinder blocks in a row in line and marrying them.
Yeah.
And maybe that was one of them. I know, but it was the longest hooded car I've ever seen in my life, especially compared with the fact that it was a coupe, convertible coupe in the back.
Yeah.
It was that was pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive. And there were a lot of course, the old yellow taxi cabs all over New York City in those days. There were still horses in New York.
Really?
We had horse-drawn milk delivery. I think I mentioned
that
that.
they went silent
sometime.
with the rubber tires.
I remember that the year that they changed from the steel-rimmed wheels to all of a sudden rubber tire wheels on the milk wagons.
Yeah.
Everything was quiet, and they'd have, of course, soft clip clops on the horses' feet. So it was very, very quiet. Yeah. When we went to Houghton, that was 1941, and so there were some cars up there. The doctor in town had a 1940, I think it was, maybe 41 Chevy, which he had all through the war. I remember one of my friends that I went to school with, his father had a a 1937 or a 1938 Buick Limited, which was the long body with the two wheels in the front fenders, two extra spare wheels in the front fenders. A big Buick Limited, and I remember his son, my buddy, we'd get in the car, and I remember once the key was there, and I remember we drove around some of that back hill road.
Really? Wow. Is that when you learned how to drive?
That was my first time driving.
Really?
As a matter of fact.
You're hooked from there.
Never stopped.
Never stopped. When you were, I guess, what about the roads then? So obviously back in the country they were paved. I'm sure then there were a mix in the city, the city being as big as it was. Like,
you know the roads. You know how our road is in front of the house here.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the good highways.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the good highways in those days.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of sort of gravel roads, a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
On my father's farm, on the front of it, we've talked about electricity before. There was a phone line. I don't think I said anything about that, but the road in front was a gravel road,
mm-hmm.
and all over the countryside it was gravel roads, and the main roads were very much like our road right here.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a little wider, but of course cars were narrower too.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all sorts of primitive shape too. They weren't all great roads.
Mm-hmm.
To drive 50 miles an hour is a fast speed.
Mm-hmm.
Be able to drive 50 miles an hour was a pretty fast speed,
mm-hmm.
for two reasons: the roads, but also the cars. You know, there was no such thing as an automatic transmission in those days, and plus there was no such thing as power steering or power brakes,
Mm-hmm.
and so you had a lot sometimes in some of those straight 8 Buick engines, and you had a lot of wheeling to turn those vehicles.
Do you remember a particularly tough one to drive, like in terms of, why does it have the gear levers going this way or anything like that? Anything was, or like a real heavy clutch? Do you remember any particularly bad car?
No.
Okay.
By the time I was driving, I wasn't really driving routinely until I went into the Army. And that was 1949, and I was, 20? And that's my really first regular driving experience of any kind. I didn't get a chance to drive my father's car.
Hmm.
Not cars, car.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I just was not afforded that opportunity very much. Hardly.
Mm-hmm.
For one thing, he was, I don't think he would have trusted me, to be honest with you. I was ready to be trusted, but not from him.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not until I didn't have that kind of comparison experience
Mm-hmm.
until sometime later.
Interesting. Do you remember having the double clutch?
Oh, hey, if you didn't know how to double clutch, there were a lot of vehicles you couldn't drive
Yeah.
without going
Yeah.
crashing gears. You learned to double clutch very quickly, very
Right.
early.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially in the truck vehicles on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a little bit of that, and you really had to be able to double clutch.
Yeah.
Same thing with the tractor. Although you didn't shift gears in the tractor much,
Mm-hmm.
you just put it in one and took off
Yeah.
slowly.
Do you, you mentioned that, like, you've talked about it before, you mentioned the electricity coming to the ranch, or the farm, and how big of an impact that had. Do you remember, was there electricity in the houses in New York City, or do you remember what it's
Oh yeah, we had electricity. Oh, New York was very much electrified.
Sure.
But it was a strange thing. Back in the 30s, there were still blocks in the area that were now I don't know how this works, but my understanding is that they were still on DC, direct current.
Mm-hmm.
and some of the equipment and implements and so forth that electrical products that we used to buy were AC, and so we had to have a converter in the basement of our place on West 55th Street, our brownstone. I remember there was in the basement something that converted it was a converter to AC, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how that really all worked. I'm not that kind of a mind. I don't have that kind of an engineering mind, but I know that that was one of the things that was going on in the electrical world then.
Sure.
Up in the farm, it must have been sometime in the late 30s, maybe, I don't know, maybe even the 40s, that the umbilical came down the highway.
Mm-hmm. But we don't remember any time in New
No,
York City.
I don't remember the exact
electricity.
time. No.
Okay, interesting.
And you know, this is very interesting, because that was in the 1900s. We're in the 2000s, and it hasn't been 100 years yet since that time. That's kind of interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.